Good afternoon, students. Since a very long we have not met each other because of practical examinations of BSc 6th semester, it was not possible for me to engage in the classes for the last week. Today, let me continue with the topics that is assigned to me. In the previous class, we had a discussion about tropic levels and what is meant by the tropic structure. Exactly how many tropic levels are there in the naturally existing ecosystems. These are some of the aspects that we discussed in the last week. Today, let me consider about the next aspect, that is food chain. Okay, what does it exactly mean by food chain? And what is the significance of the food chain? And how many kinds of food chains are existing in the natural ecosystems? These are some of the aspects that I would like to discuss. Before going to explain what is exactly meant by food chain, I would like to consider some basic aspects of the food chain. By understanding these basic aspects, it is possible for you to understand what does exactly mean by a food chain. Suppose if you consider any naturally existing ecosystems, maybe a grassland ecosystem, a forest ecosystem, an ocean ecosystem, there food is going to be produced by green plants. Food is going to be produced by the green plants. That is why we treat green plants as producers. Because it is these green plants, by the help of light energy and using the process that is photosynthesis, they prepare the food, they synthesize the food. We usually treat producers, I mean the green plants which are present in the different ecosystems, as the first organisms which are going to derive the food. What happens next is the food present in the producers is getting transferred to the next organisms, next level organisms, which we consider them as primary consumers. Basically, the primary consumers are the one, they are herbivores, they are plant eaters. By means of eating the green plants, they get their food. Whenever these primary consumers, they feed upon the green plants or the producers, the food that is being present there in the green plants is getting transferred to primary consumers. Next, what happens is there are carnivores such as secondary consumers present. Look at this. Secondary consumers are the animals which usually feed upon the primary consumers. We consider them as primary carnivores. What happens is when these primary consumers are eaten up by the secondary consumers, at that time the food present in the primary consumers is getting transferred to secondary consumers. Like that, supposing there are tertiary consumers present, even these tertiary consumers are usually the carnivores. We consider them as secondary carnivores. The secondary carnivores, they usually feed upon the primary carnivores, which are regarded as secondary consumers. When tertiary consumers feeds upon the secondary consumers, at that time, the food present in the secondary consumers is getting transferred to tertiary consumers. Suppose there are quaternary consumers present in the ecosystem, and these quaternary consumers, they usually feed upon the tertiary consumers. By means of feeding upon the tertiary consumers, yes, they are getting their food. And these quaternary consumers are usually considered as tertiary carnivores. Well, that's it. Simply what happens is, transfer of food takes place from producers to consumers of various levels by means of repeated eating and being eaten up. Say when the producers are eaten up by the primary consumers, at that time food is present there in the producers is getting transferred to primary consumers. Like that, when primary consumers are eaten up by the secondary consumers, at that time food present in the primary consumers is getting transferred to secondary consumers. When these secondary consumers are eaten up by the tertiary consumers, at that time food present in the secondary consumers is getting transferred to tertiary consumers. Producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary, maybe quaternary consumers. These are supposed to be the organisms which are usually present in the form of a definite sequence, and they are arranged in the form of a chain. It is a chain of organisms. Through this chain of organisms, what happens is transfer of food takes place from organisms of one trophic level to organisms of another trophic level. You all know that producers, they belongs to first trophic level. Okay. Like that, if you consider primary consumers, all primary consumers, they belongs to second trophic level. Okay. Then secondary consumers belongs to third trophic level. Okay. Like that, tertiary consumers belongs to fourth trophic level. Even quaternary consumers are belonging to fifth trophic level. These are the organisms which are very systematically arranged in the form of a chain. Through this chain of organisms, what happens is transfer of food takes place from one organism to another organisms. We call this chain, which helps in the transfer of food, is referred as the food chain. Okay, food chain is actually, it is a chain of organisms where transfer of food occurs from one organism to another organism by repeated eating and being eaten up. This is how we define food chain. Write down the definition like this. Food chain is the chain of organisms, through which transfer of food takes place. Transfer of food takes place by repeated eating and being eaten up. Yes. This is how we define food chain. And always remember one thing, that in naturally existing ecosystems, food chain is having three to five links. 3 to 5 links. So for example here, the food chain starts with the producers. You take any ecosystem for that matter, always producers are the organisms which are forming the very first link. Then from producers, food is getting transferred to primary consumers. These primary consumers are forming the second link in the food chain. Suppose if tertiary consumers are there, secondary consumers are there. These secondary consumers form the third link. Sometimes what happens is, there in the ecosystems, in addition to secondary consumers, we also find tertiary consumers. Even sometimes we also find the additional link, that is quaternary consumers. Suppose if tertiary consumers are there, then in the food chain there are 4 links: producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. Suppose by chance there in the ecosystem, if quaternary consumers are also there, then these quaternary consumers are usually forming the 5th link. That is why we are usually saying that 3 to 5 links are present there in the food chain of naturally existing ecosystems. And the question is, do the producers form the first link in the food chains? Yes, definitely. Except some exceptional food chains, in most of the food chains that we are observing, producers forms the very first link. Then primary consumers forms the second link. Tertiary consumers forms the third link. Like this, through these links, what happens is transfer of food takes place almost in the form of a chain. We refer this as a food chain. Let me consider the types of food chains. How many types of food chains are there? Yes, food chains are of 3 types. The very first kind of food chain is usually called as the predator food chain. The second kind of food chain is usually called as parasitic food chain. And the third kind of food chain is usually called as detritus food chain. Okay, let me consider the very first one, predator food chain. Okay, usually this predator food chain starts with the producers. Normally it starts with the producers. Then it continues on even the transfer of food occurs from smaller consumers to larger consumers. Okay, it is just like this. Look here. In this kind of food chain, producers are the one. They are nothing but the green plants. By the way of photosynthesis, they produce the food. Okay. What happens next is, directly from producers, the transfer of food takes place to the primary consumers, then to secondary consumers. Usually these primary and secondary consumers are small in size. That is why we refer them as small consumers. Then the higher consumers, maybe tertiary consumers or quaternary consumers are concerned, they are usually larger in size. Here, what happens is transfer of food finally takes place to the larger consumers. How does it happen? It happens by repeated eating and being eaten. Larger consumers are going to eat upon the smaller consumers. Then these smaller consumers are going to eat upon the producers. By means of repeated eating and being eaten up, transfer of food occurs. So, for example, one simple example that I would like to give you. Take the example of grassland ecosystem. There in the grassland ecosystem, grasses are the major producers that you know. They are the most usual green plants which produce the food by the way of photosynthesis. That is why we consider grasses as the producers. And these grasses are going to be consumed by primary consumers. Basically, the insects like grasshoppers. Okay. They feed upon the grasses and gets their food. And you also know that yes, these grasshoppers are going to be feeded by the animals like frogs. Look at this, frogs are a little bit larger than grasshoppers. Then transfer of food takes place from frogs to higher level consumers. They are supposed to be the snakes. Snakes, when they feed upon the frogs, there is food present in the frogs getting transferred to snakes. Even the snakes are further conjured by the top carnivorous animals like hawks. Look at the transfer of food, how exactly the food has been transferred, starting from grasses. Okay, here food is transferred from grasses to smaller consumers first. Okay. Maybe the grasshoppers, maybe the frogs, they are basically the smaller consumers. Then what happens? Then transfer of food takes place from smaller consumers to larger consumers. Say for example, snakes and hawks, they are consumers. They are larger in size when compared to grasshoppers and frogs. That is why we consider here that then the predator food chain, transfer of food occurs from producers to smaller consumers, then finally to larger consumers. Let me consider the second kind of food chain. We consider the second kind of food chain as parasitic food chain. Consider the parasitic food chain. Okay, parasitic food chain is the one. Here, in this food chain, parasites are involved. Ultimate transfer of food takes place to the parasites. Because of that reason, we refer them as parasitic food. And another important thing that you must remember here is, even this food chain also starts with the producers. But it also begins with the producers. And third important thing is, here transfer of food occurs from producers to larger consumers, and gradually to smaller consumers. Okay, this is what it happens. Then in the pharmaceutical food chain, no doubt, green plants are producers, that's at the first link. They manufacture the food. And that food produced by the producers is first of all getting transferred to larger consumers, means consumers of the larger size, animals of the larger size. And finally, the food is being transferred to consumers of the smaller size. Say for example, you consider an ecosystem like a forest. Ecosystem like a forest. Any forest ecosystem for that matter, you consider. Maybe in the forest ecosystem, trees are the common producers. These are the producers. they are very commonly present. And they produce the food by the way of photosynthesis. Okay. Assume that in that tree, there are so many birds present, fruit-eating birds. Whenever these birds, they feed upon the products of the trees like fruits, at that time, the food present in the trees is getting transferred to the birds. Assume that in the body of these birds, maybe there are parasites present. Yes, parasites like bugs may be present. Assume. Bugs are the parasites which are living on the body of the birds, and they directly suck the ready-made food available in the birds. They suck the food. At that time, the food is transferred to what we call as bugs. Even there in the body of each bug, so many bacteria present. Bacteria are living inside the body of the bugs. Whenever bugs get the food, yes, some amount of food is being taken by the bacteria. They absorb the food present there in the body of bugs. Here, bacteria are bugs. They are basically good. They are basically the parasites. Means in this food chain, parasites are involved. Even this food chain, it starts with the producers. In the parasitic food chain, what happens is transfer of food takes place from producers to consumers of the larger size, then to consumers of the smaller size. Look here, birds are the consumers, bugs are the consumers. They are usually larger in size when compared to the bacteria. Bacteria, they act as the parasites, which are much smaller in size when compared to bugs. Yes, these are the smaller consumers. What happens here is transfer of food takes place from producers to larger consumers and finally to smaller consumers. And these smaller consumers are usually the parasites. We refer such a kind of food chain as parasitic food chain. And let me consider the third kind of food chain. Which we consider as detritus food chain. Detritus food chain. Detritus refers to organic matter. It refers to organic matter. Any decaying matter. In the food chain, it starts with the detritus, that's the decaying organic matter. It starts with the detritus. Okay. And secondly, transfer of food. Food involves the part reverse. In this food chain, some organisms are going to involve, some organisms are going to take part. These organisms are referred as detrivores. Detrivores are the organisms, they normally feed upon the decaying organic matter. Okay, say for example, the detritus, which is going to be formed by the decaying leaves. Normally in the ecosystem, the leaves used to fall to the ground. After some time, they get decayed, and these decaying leaves are going to form the detritus. Okay, there are some organisms such as earthworms considered. There are some organisms like earthworms. These earthworms directly feed upon the detritus, that is the decaying matter. By means of feeding upon the detritus, the food present in the detritus is getting incorporated into the body of earthworms. And these earthworms may be eaten up by the animals like frogs. Then frogs may be eaten up by the animals like snakes. Look at this food chain. Which is the first link here? The first link is the detritus of the organic matter. Okay, and this food chain starts with the detritus. That is why we usually refer this as detritus food chain. And in this food chain, the detrivores are involved. Detrivores means the organisms which are supposed to be feeding upon the organic matter. Earthworms are the most common detrivores. They are usually present in every coastal ecosystem. Okay. And from this earthworms, yes, the transfer of food takes place to other consumers like frogs, maybe snakes, etc. We refer to such a kind of food chain as detritus food chain. Even in some of your books, these are so referred as saprophytic food chain. Because this food chain starts with the what you call as detritus. It is nothing but the organic matter. Okay. I hope it is clear. Then let me consider the food web. Food web. Web refers to intricate network. Spider web. Suppose if you consider the spider web, okay, there in the spider web, what you will find is you will find the presence of the strands which are arranged in the circular fashion, and they are arranged one over the other. Not only you are observing these circularly placed strands, even these circularly placed strands are strengthened further by the vertical strands, which are usually laid in the varieties of directions. So, here a web-like structure is going. A network-like structure is being reproduced. I am asking one simple question. When we consider the food chain, let me consider the food chain. Usually there in the food chain, what we observe is, we observe producers, which forms the very first link. And we are going to say that they belong to the first group. Then transfer of food occurs from producers to primary consumers. And these primary consumers are forming the second cooking. Okay. Then primary consumers are giving up their food to the secondary consumers. When the secondary consumers are going to feed upon the primary consumers, at that time the food present in the second trophic level organisms getting transferred to secondary consumers or third trophic level organisms. Then transfer of food takes place from secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. By chance, if quaternary consumers are there, then even further transfer of food occurs from tertiary to quaternary consumers. But this here, food is getting transferred through the sequence of organisms. My basic question is, in nature, transfer of food is going to follow this linear fashion. Is it going to follow this linear fashion? For example, you consider one simple ecosystem, such as the grassland ecosystem. Okay. In this grassland ecosystem, of course, grasses are the producers. Grasses are the producers. And they form the very first trophic level. Okay. One of them, by the way of photosynthesis, they produce their food. Next, what happens is the food produced from the grasses is getting transferred to insects, maybe the grasshoppers. Okay. Even sometimes if rodents are present, then these rodents also directly feed upon the grasses or their products, so that they get their food directly from the grasses. And these grasshoppers and the grasses, when they are getting their food directly from the grasses, we refer them as herbivores, or even primary consumers for that matter. These primary consumers are forming the second trophic level. Okay. Next, what happens is, there in the grassland, maybe animals like frogs are present. Okay, usually frog is deriving its food from the grasshoppers. It feeds upon the grasshoppers and gets its food. Maybe sometimes the garden lizards may also be present. Garden lizards, they are the most common animals. They feed upon these grasses and gets their food. So here frogs and garden lizards are basically depending upon the grasshoppers, which are primary consumers. That is why we consider frogs and garden lizards as secondary consumers. Okay. Suppose if there are snakes present, snakes very commonly feed upon the frogs. Even they could also feed upon the garden lizards. So that here what happens is transfer of food takes place from secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. Here snakes are considered as tertiary consumers. By chance, if there are quaternary consumers like eagles present or hawks present, these eagles or hawks, they normally feed upon the snakes. If snakes are acting as a tertiary consumers, then eagles acts as quaternary consumers. Okay. Then these snakes